Well, hello. My name is Evan Reese, and on behalf of the U.S. Resiliency Council and our series sponsor, Optimum Seismic, welcome to this fifth program in the Resilience Advantage webinar series. We hope you've enjoyed and learned during our previous webinars. Today, we'll be looking at another important subject, how we use earthquake retrofits to protect existing older buildings, the people in them, and the investments they represent. The U.S. Resiliency Council is a nonprofit organization founded 11 years ago that works to improve community resilience one building at a time. We believe in the power of building performance rating systems, educational programs such as the Resilience Advantage, and coalition building with a wide variety of stakeholders. We do this in order to transform our built environment in the directions it needs to go, towards a more sustainable, equitable, prosperous, and resilient future. Right now, it's my pleasure to introduce Tom Robinson of Optimum Seismic, a leader in the sustainability and resilience movement. Tom, welcome to the Resilience Advantage. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background, what you do with Optimum Seismic, and why Optimum Seismic has been so passionate about seismic retrofit?
Thank you, Evan. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Before I came to Optimum Seismic, I worked as a city manager. I've dealt with the very large Los Angeles County Fire Department and a small volunteer fire department. Most of my emergency experience dealt with the soft issues of training and exercises. But now that I'm with Optimum Seismics, I've joined a team that has been working to make cities physically safer from earthquakes since 1984. We've been spreading the word about the retrofit process and resilience for many years. We've completed more than 3,500 retrofit and renovation projects throughout California. And I want to say that so much has changed during the time that we've been working on this. Engineers and architects have learned how to do projects better and more cost effectively. Most situations the property owners or business owners encounter have very practical retrofit solutions that can be done in a relatively short time frame without disturbing or displacing residents or other occupants. The experts that we will hear today will make it clear that retrofits are now effective and economical tools to achieve your business objectives. Whether your goal is protecting your tenants, your income stream, your equity, your building, earthquake retrofits are a proven tool to achieve those ends. Retrofits are something you do to make your building and investments more secure. As we say, retrofits are good business, good policy, and good stewardship. We at Optimum Seismic are very proud to sponsor the Resilience Advantage series. We'll be doing this throughout this year and produce 12 of these educational webinars. At this time, I'd like to thank our major partners, organizations who have joined with us over the years to focus attention on the vital messages of earthquake resilience for our business community. Our major partners include the Los Angeles Area Chamber of Commerce, the Los Angeles County Business Federation, Los Angeles County Economic Development Corporation, and the U.S. Resiliency Council. In addition to that, we also have organizations that are serving as champions for individual program episodes. And today's champions are the Los Angeles County Business Federation, and we'll be hearing from them shortly, and the Los Angeles Conservancy, and we'll be hearing from them shortly. Both of these groups have worked hard to support the important messages of this series. And Evan, I'd like you now to tell the audience a bit more about the Resilience Advantage webinar series.
Thanks, Tom. I'd too like to echo my thanks to our champions, our business champions, and a shout out to our local government entities that have contributed to this series. Tom mentioned that he was a city manager. It's really important for us to reach stakeholders in the private and public sector. And so that really does mean having good conversations with folks in building departments, in city government. And so we appreciate your tuning in and joining us as well. So our goal in this series is to tell the story of how investing in readiness for natural disasters can benefit all of us. Each episode focuses on a specific part of the story. January's episode on new construction is a little different from what you'll see today about retrofitting existing buildings. And our April episode on green design and sustainability is a bit different from the incentive strategies that we'll talk about in a future episode. But they all fit together in an intricate quilt, if you will, that reflects the complex world of earthquake resilience. Each part is important to the overall whole. Our plan for this series is to communicate in a contemporary way with on-demand videos using visuals, plain speak, memorable people, subject matter experts, and case studies. We appreciate our friends at Compassion International, or Compassion Unlimited, for their hard work and artistry in bringing our vision to life. Over 30 virtual interviews during this COVID year. So thank you to David and Ross for your great work. In this episode, you're about to see goes beyond the technical side of just how to do retrofits. That's important, but even more important than the how is the why you retrofit. This episode brings together real people to share practical examples of why they did retrofits. Their experience will help you better understand why retrofits are important tools in the toolbox for property owners and developers wanting to protect their businesses, investments, and tenants by improving older buildings. But the bottom line of what you'll hear today, whether you're protecting a multifamily apartment, renovating a commercial or industrial building, or preserving affordable housing or historic buildings, is that earthquakes will likely play a key role in your project at some point in California and other states with high seismic risks. It's very important for you to include seismic retrofits in your plans for older buildings. Find reputable and experienced structural engineers, architects, and contractors. Have an engineering assessment done of your property to learn about the obstacles that you may face. Then have plans developed that provide the appropriate solution for your situation. Consider the full range of options presented to you, and then make an informed decision about how best to proceed. So we hope you enjoyed this episode, and stay tuned following it for the discussion with our expert panelists. With that, I'd like to introduce the Resilience Advantage.
Welcome to the Resilience Advantage, a series brought to you by the U.S. Resiliency Council and Optimum Seismic. I'm your host, Evan Reese, and we'll be exploring what resilience means to our communities in the face of natural disasters like earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, wildfire, and now even pandemics. In this episode, we'll discuss the social and economic benefits of preserving our older, vulnerable building stock, making sure they protect their most precious contents, the people who live, work, go to school, and conduct business in them, as well as the critical functions they provide for their owners, tenants, and the community. Recapping from our first episode, structural engineering experts talked about the limited objectives of building codes, how they are developed over time, and why our ability to make buildings safe and earthquake resistant evolves over time.
When we have major events, there are changes that come because we learn from earthquakes every time something happens. We update the codes and with new lessons learned.
In any city like San Francisco or Los Angeles, 80 to 90% of the building stock was built before our modern codes were developed over the past, say, 30 years.
Many of those were built in the 50s and 60s, maybe into the 70s. What we do today in the building codes should take care of all the problems in those older structures.
But for many known vulnerable older building types, we can't count on the things we take for granted in modern structures, like prevention of collapse and repairability, and protection from loss of use or even loss of life. The occurrence of the next big earthquake, or hurricane, flood, or wildfire is not a matter of if, but when. We don't have to look too far into the past to see how entire cities can be devastated when buildings fail. The twin earthquakes in Christchurch, New Zealand in 2010 and 2011 are case in point.
That caused a tremendous amount of damage and disruption to the city. 70% of the buildings in the central business district had to be demolished after the earthquake.
The retrofits you'll learn about vary from large manufacturing facilities to historic properties that anchor neighborhood character and revitalization, to preservation of multifamily housing. What they have in common are significant economic, safety, and social benefits. To begin, AnheuserBusch is one of the most well-known brands in the world. It built a large brewery in Van Nuys, California back in 1954. Like most large structures of the time, it was constructed of heavy concrete walls and floors that lacked ductile reinforcing. In the 1971 San Fernando earthquake, the brewery was heavily damaged and production was halted, allowing its competitors to cut deeply into its market share. AnheuserBusch took action in the early 1980s to prevent a repeat experience when the next large earthquake inevitably happened. But they didn't do things haphazardly. AnheuserBusch spent $11 million to retrofit its vulnerable buildings. This was less than 1% of the replacement cost of the brewery, worth nearly $1.3 billion at the time. It wasn't long before that investment paid off. The epicenter of the 1994 Northridge earthquake was only a few miles from the Van Nuys brewery and caused significant shaking. Many buildings collapsed at sites near the brewery, but none of the AnheuserBusch retrofitted buildings suffered any significant damage. After minor cleanup, the brewery was restored to full operations in less than a week. This time around, they lost no market share to their competitors, and were even able to produce cans of water to provide free to the community. AnheuserBusch estimated that had they not retrofitted their buildings, the cost would have exceeded $750 million in property and business losses. Lance Hastings, president of the California Manufacturers and Technology Association, praised the project.
A lot of machinery is involved there to get the beer into the bottles or the cans, and they've been able to get ahead of the curve and plan against current and future events, and really to be applauded.
It might be tempting for owners of vulnerable types of older buildings to think that ignorance is bliss, that if they haven't been specifically told by an engineer or a building department that their building is vulnerable, they'll be free from liability when the earthquake occurs. Others may believe that if a city does have an ordinance that requires them to retrofit but gives them, say, 15 years to comply, they have no liability before the deadline is up. Those beliefs are not supported by the facts, and that misunderstanding can not only cost lives, it can financially ruin a business owner. I spoke with Madison Spock, a Southern California attorney, about the legal liability that owners of vulnerable buildings may face.
If you have a restaurant or you own any premises where there's a condition that might be dangerous to people who enter onto the premises, then you have a duty to make those premises safe for them.
Are there examples that you can think of where owners were caught unawares and paid a price for not taking proactive steps to retrofit their buildings?
There was a case that came out of the December 22nd, 2003 Paso Robles, from Paso Robles in the San Simeon earthquake, where it's a perfect example of what you're asking about. Acorn Building, the owner of that building had dates that had been projected. The city projected dates way out into the future. And the owner had a very dangerous building but had not put into it the necessary work in order to make sure that the building had come into compliance. The question is, what did that owner need to do? Could that owner just sit back? The answer to that from the court was no, absolutely not. Because when the San Simeon earthquake hit at 11 in the morning, two of the workers, a young woman who was home and was about to start her college career, and a woman 55 who had just gotten her daughter off to school and just gotten her daughter into school, they both tried to flee the building, and as they were fleeing the building, it actually collapsed on the two women. And those two women were the two lives that were lost, tragically, in the San Simeon earthquake.
I assume the same would translate into a city, even if it had no ordinances, because the fact that some building types are vulnerable is now common knowledge, where maybe that wasn't the case a few decades ago.
An absolutely excellent point, Evan, an excellent point, because even if the city has chosen not to act for whatever reason and not to impose its own, and let's assume for some reason that a state ordinance doesn't apply. It doesn't mean that the law of general negligence doesn't apply, because the law of general negligence always applies to such conditions.
What about in some cities that haven't required retrofits, but say they've required owners of unreinforced masonry structures, for example, to put a plaque on the building? It says, "This is a potentially dangerous unreinforced masonry structure." Can posting a warning alone absolve the owner from liability?
It's unlikely that the plaque would be sufficient for a simple reason. No one knows when an incredibly large seismic event is going to occur. When you enter the building under those circumstances, there is simply no way that you can protect yourself from a seismic event. If the building begins to collapse, and it collapses because of the condition of the building, you don't have a way to protect yourself in the same way you do as when you walk across a slippery floor.
Madison, what would be the first piece of advice that you'd give a business or building owner trying to decide whether they should be concerned and investigate, or whether they can just sort of try and avoid the issue?
My first advice would be, don't talk to your lawyer. Talk to your engineer, talk to your architect, talk to someone who can tell you what the condition of the building is. Because a lawyer can walk through your building and say, I think that's a problem, let's set up a committee and let's do step by step something that plays well. Ultimately, if you have to go to trial on that issue, if you said, well, I went to a lawyer and I set up a nice little plan, there's not much better evidence that a plaintiff's lawyer could have of those circumstances. Get to a structural engineer, to an architect, to an expert who can identify potentially dangerous conditions on the property and can identify what the remedies are for mitigating that possible problem, and someone who knows what amount of money it takes to fix it, because surprisingly, a lot of retrofitting is not as expensive as people think. It can often be done at a very reasonable price.
One example of an owner who recognized their responsibilities to bring older buildings into compliance with modern building codes for safety, and who enhanced the neighborhood by preserving local character, was Optimum Seismic, the developer of the Weinman Building in San Luis Obispo, California. Craig Smith, the project architect, spoke about the building, the challenges and adaptive reuse of the historic structure, and how the developer's concerns about liability led them to seismically retrofit the structure.
And the Weinman Hotel building was built in 1932. It was considered at that time a contributing hospitality development because the mission was here and they were trying to elevate tourism. And it was derelict for probably close to 25, almost 30 years. The building was found to have a number of idiosyncrasies, if not uniqueness, in both its character and the need to adaptively reconstruct it to be both seismically correct and everything all current legal buildings would have to have.
Ali Sahabi is the co-founder of Optimum Seismic. Ali, why did you consider such an old building with known seismic deficiencies a worthwhile investment?
The Weinman Building was a hotel that stopped operating as a hotel and became depleted, and it was a large enough building that you could create a mixed use project where you have commercial on the first floor and residential on the second floor. As we all know, for the last several decades, affordable housing and lack of new housing, production of new housing has been an issue here in California. So part of the economics of that building was the city was very, very much interested in creating some additional rental units, which is what we were able to do at Weinman by introducing 48 units of residential on top of this very prime commercial corner.
Ali, how do you measure the success of this project?
Number one, it's the economics. As a developer, as an investor, we want to make sure that we're getting the return on our investment. And with that, we want to make sure that our building, the end result is desirable. If we have residential users, or if we have retail or any other commercial type of uses, as long as we have tenants that want to be there. That's our number one way of measuring the result. Second is most of these buildings are unique. They're located in downtowns and a special old part of towns with character, and it represents the pride of the community. So when the building looks good, when the building looks like the way it was originally was meant to be built 100 years ago or 120 years ago, it means a lot to the community. They take pride in it. Most of these renovation projects are really close collaboration of the three disciplines of architects, structural engineers, and contractors. When you're dealing with an existing building structure, when you start drawing the plans for as-built or you start designing the solutions, really all you're doing is based on what you know at the time. And it's almost certain that it's going to change once you start these projects. And that's when the architect and engineers get involved again with the construction trades. They need to come up with the solution as the project is going on. Alternative ways of retrofitting, either to make sure that we are meeting the intent of the historical preservation and at the same time the intent of the structural integrity of the retrofitting and the design.
We've seen the tragic outcomes that can occur when cities don't adopt modern building codes or mitigate their existing vulnerabilities. One of the clearest examples of the opportunities and challenges that come with renovating and retrofitting older buildings are historic structures.
Hi, my name is Linda Dishman, and I'm the president and CEO of the Los Angeles Conservancy. Historic buildings provide a touchstone, a place where people know where they are, and people become very attached, both in their neighborhood and in the city at large, of buildings where they've had a particularly happy memory, or something happened in their lives, or something historic happened there that they associate with. One of the things we've learned is that proactive action does make a difference. In terms of retrofitting buildings, when the city of Los Angeles did Division 88 to retrofit all of the unreinforced masonry buildings and required property owners to do that, they did it. And when the Northridge earthquake happened, there was no loss of life from an unreinforced masonry building because all the buildings had been made safe in terms of the actual event itself.
Retrofitting older buildings to bring them into compliance with modern engineering standards of safety when the structure is historic can be particularly challenging, and on the more expensive side among different types of seismic retrofits. But it can dramatically improve and revitalize whole neighborhoods and downtowns, bringing in business and spurring other owners to improve their own buildings. Another example of such a project was the renovation of the Society Hotel in downtown Portland, Oregon. I discussed the project with Jonathan Cohen, one of the building's developers.
Our building in Portland, Oregon is a really interesting one. It was built in 1880, kind of a safe place for sailors, kind of like a YMCA. It operated for about 10 years until 1901, when they sold it to Japanese family, Japanese Americans. The area had become New Japantown. A small Tong or fraternal organization, Chinese fraternal organization, purchased our building in 1944, but the last event was really held in 1952, and then after that the building sat dormant on the upper floors until we purchased it in 2013.
What made this a worthwhile investment for you?
I think to take on a project like this, you have to be passionate about it. I also love old buildings, and I love the stories, and I love being able to reimagine them for a new future, new ways to use them, and new people to experience them with all the modern amenities that we expect in newer buildings. It needed a completely new structural system, completely new mechanical, electrical, plumbing system, fire suppression, and a fire life safety system. So really a gut rehab while basically maintaining the entire interior structure and almost all of the materials. We really saved about 95% of all materials in the building and either removed them and replaced them or left them in place.
Now, I'm assuming you went into this with eyes wide open. You knew because you have experience that a building this old was going to take some significant work. Was it necessary to do a seismic upgrade too?
Yeah, there were multiple triggers in working through the permitting process with the city of Portland that sort of corralled us into a required seismic upgrade. We selected a really excellent structural engineer who both myself and my other partners have worked with many times on other projects and had a lot of experience working with and upgrading, doing seismic retrofits for older buildings. The other critical design criteria that we learned very early on, because we were also going with placing this building on the National Historic Register, was that the state historic representative let us know that they would not accept an internal brace frame style construction for shear resistance. So we would be forced to use cast in place concrete walls for our shear resistance all the way up through the building.
Jonathan, in a historic property retrofit, there can be additional restrictions and requirements, and you and I both know that means costs. Were there any kinds of financial incentives that either the city or federal or state governments offered you to help foot the bill for the seismic retrofit and other work?
The short answer is no. And that's not for lack of trying. It's a real barrier to why there's not more of our buildings that are prepared for resilience in Portland.
You know, when an existing building, an older building like this, is made more resilient and preserved, a lot of people benefit. Lending institutions, insurers on the property, they all benefit too. Jonathan, what kinds of incentives would have been meaningful to you and made this process easier?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think the answer in the current environment is just cash. It could be preferable loan terms or a really favorable loan to assist with that. And we need some real policymakers above the level of administrative folks at the planning agencies to support this.
The U.S. Resiliency Council was really pleased in 2019 to award the Society Hotel and 3 other 100-year-old Portland properties that had also undergone significant retrofit silver ratings, meaning they are essentially similar to modern code buildings. What did that mean to you to receive that rating for the building?
Well, it's really a wonderful accolade, and we're very much appreciative of the recognition of our project. You know, we, as I mentioned earlier, it's a passion project for me and my wife, and we care very much about preserving this building and telling its story. And resiliency and thinking long-term about the survival of this building is the way that we're going to be able to keep doing that. So to be recognized for that is very nice.
So how do you think the renovation of the Society Hotel helped to revitalize that old Chinatown neighborhood?
It's a real catalyst project for the neighborhood, I believe, because as I mentioned earlier, there are many, many other buildings of its vintage in the neighborhood which have not been upgraded yet, and they would like to. And I think our project provides real guidance for a way that that can be done. And after we completed our project, dozens of buildings transacted, sold, and some were renovated. And one right around the corner did a similar renovation, and we're very proud of that. And we'd love to see as many of the buildings in Old Town be preserved as possible.
It might seem like the engineering challenges that come with retrofitting older or historic structures are daunting, but Linda Dishman notes that often creative solutions are available and accessible.
Retrofitting historic buildings has come such a long way since, we first started doing this, in the 70s and 80s. And at that point, it was a very intrusive system with lots of steel that was inserted into spaces. You felt safe because you could see all of the structure. Engineers have done an amazing job at really pushing the envelope and finding new technologies to make these buildings secure and not have it be so intrusive into decorated spaces. We're big fans of adaptive reuse because sometimes uses change. And also there's the sustainability factor, is that reusing these buildings means they're not going to the dump, and that we're able to reuse that. It's much more that, the saying is the greenest building is the one that's already built.
What about preserving and protecting our existing affordable housing supply from earthquake damage?
Starting to look now at how do we preserve existing affordable housing, because the feeling is you can't build your way out of an affordable housing crisis. And so particularly if you keep losing affordable housing to build market rate.
We learned in this episode that up to 90% of the building stock in our cities was designed and built prior to the development of more modern codes. Each time a natural disaster occurs, we learn about what went right and what didn't. Structural engineers take this information, coupled with advances in science and technology, and gradually update our building codes to improve the safety and functionality of our buildings. Codes address both new construction and, importantly, standards for how to most cost-effectively retrofit known weaknesses in older buildings. Importantly, though, cities have to adopt approved codes, and not all cities keep up. The current state of awareness about vulnerable building types means anywhere earthquakes are a known problem, owners with older buildings are leaving themselves exposed to legal liability risk, even if they have not explicitly been told that their buildings may be hazardous. We've heard from developers that have taken on historic and adaptive reuse renovations and reaped the business rewards, public gratitude, and personal satisfaction of preserving the past and contributing to an exciting future for their communities. Working with expert engineers who are employing new technologies and the latest science is key to achieving these results cost effectively. And we'll explore this more in future episodes. Next time on The Resilience Advantage, we'll consider the connections between the environmental sustainability movement, green design, and disaster resilience. In order for our businesses and communities to be truly sustainable in the light of natural hazards that are increasing, we must not only build green, reducing our impact on the environment, but also resiliently, where the environment has a low impact on us. Thank you for watching, and please join us next time on The Resilience Advantage.
All right, well, thank you. I hope you enjoyed that episode. It was a lot of fun to make. A lot of fun to look at some of these older buildings, and especially the historic ones, and how you can take an old building and renovate it, sometimes even hide the work that was done, the structural work that was done, and make it usable for another 100 years. Now we'd like to introduce our panel discussion. We have several folks that you saw on the episode itself. Linda Dishman, who's the president and CEO of the LA Conservancy. Jonathan Cohen, the partner at the Society Hotel in Portland, whose great project you saw highlighted. And Madison Spock, a partner at Spock, Capaldi, and Wagaman, who gave us a lot of interesting and I think sobering information on liability. And we'll talk a little bit more about that with him today. I'd also like to welcome Tracy Hernandez. Welcome back, Tracy Hernandez, the founding CEO of Los Angeles County BizFed, Business Federation. She has been a great champion of the Resilience Advantage, and we're happy to have her back on the show. And then David Koch, a structural engineer in Los Angeles, and who's president of Structural Focus. And David has a lot of experience in the seismic retrofit of older buildings. So thank you all to our panelists. And let's just sort of kick this off. I'd like to start with Tracy. Tracy, I know that you've been advocating for many years that commercial and industrial businesses become more resilient, that's an important part of business. It's an important part of the sustainability, if you will, of the members of LA BizFed. Why do you believe that earthquake retrofits and other measures are so important to protecting our businesses and our economy of the local area?
Evan, it's an important question. As you mentioned at BizFed, just a reminder, we're this unusual, massive network of business networks, 455,000 companies of every shape and size throughout the greater LA region are part of BizFed. And as we talk about this issue, we don't always agree on everything, but I'll tell you specifically what we universally do agree on. And one is, of course, life safety, protecting all of our employees and our customers is mission one. Dealing with cost of damage in an earthquake situation, our entire region's economic survival, risk of depleted jobs and services in our community over a long span post-event. And so obviously getting involved now, retrofitting now, being prepared will tackle all of those vital issues.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine that many of your members have been in business in Southern California for years or even decades. So it isn't as if they're coming in, one, not knowing the situation with earthquake hazards in Southern California, but also they're coming in with a long-term perspective, knowing that they or their families or their shareholders want to be around for many years or decades to come. And so this for them is not a short-term question. It's a long-term consideration. Would you agree?
Absolutely agree. One, to do business in Los Angeles is already very expensive. So if you've invested, if you need a physical facility to do business, you've already analyzed where you're at. You've already taken quite a while to get the funding together to decide that the cost of doing business here is worth it, and it's a big investment. So, of course, protecting that for not only the near term, but the long term is, one, it's common sense, but it's also vital business sense.
Great. Well, thanks, Tracy, and thank you for the support that bizfed has given us so far. I'd like to bring David Koch into the discussion. So again, David is a structural engineer. David, maybe you could just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your practice and what you do. I think you're on mute.
In Southern California, of about 25 people. I'm actually on the board of the LA Conservancy with Linda, so I have I'm very passionate, as you know, Evan, about historic buildings and adaptive reuse of existing buildings.
Well, David, what makes an older building more vulnerable to earthquakes, and why is it that they're still around? Why is it that we don't condemn all older buildings, but what makes them vulnerable?
Well, what makes them vulnerable in reality is a lot of them were built before any modern codes at all. With every significant earthquake that occurs, we learn a lot, not only structural engineers, seismologists, and even the communities. People like Tracy learn about what buildings are vulnerable and which ones aren't. Over the decades since the earliest seismic codes that were written in 1930s, we've learned that some buildings are significantly more susceptible to shaking than others. So a building designed and constructed decades ago may have a very different earthquake resisting system that buildings that have been built later to the latest code provisions, which are revised generally about every 3 years.
Yeah, we think of something like a phone or like an iPhone, and when they're built, they undergo thousands of hours of testing, right? They shake them and they break them, and so they know very well how these phones are going to behave. But when it comes to a building, we do have large scale testing laboratories, but we can't simply shake every building and see exactly how it's going to perform. So that's part of the structural engineering environment, is we learn from the events themselves. And that's why you'll see engineers fan out all over a region a city where there's been an earthquake, to learn about what went right and what didn't. So when it comes to historic buildings, what are some of the particular challenges that a structural engineer like yourself would face in trying to renovate those or retrofit those?
Well, the first obvious challenge is we really don't necessarily have detailed documentation of how that building was constructed. The second, but the more overriding challenge, is that we have to learn to balance the need to preserve the building, try to make it more resistant to earthquake shaking, but at the same time, we don't want to do a poor design that damages the significant elements of that same building. So we really do have to walk a fine line and bring all the stakeholders into it, just like Jonathan, to come in and talk to us and figure out, negotiate a scheme that's going to work for that particular building, especially if it's something special.
And no doubt, if you don't have structural drawings, or I guess maybe sometimes even if you do, you'll encounter unexpected conditions. Walls that aren't built the way you thought they'd be built, or elements in different places, or elements that are missing. I think that may scare a lot of people, may worry a lot of people when it comes to, the potential for investing in a property like the way Jonathan did or Optimum Seismic did. What happens when you encounter unexpected conditions? How does the project team usually deal with that?
Yeah, it's a real problem. I mean, it happens all the time. Not only are we even lucky if we get any documentation, but that documentation might not be very accurate for what was actually built. The quality control decades and decades ago wasn't necessarily very good. And then buildings are modified all the time. I was working on the Hotel del Coronado, which was constructed in 1882, and we found many instances where they cut a column off that supported several stories above, and then they just patched the hole in the ceiling and kept going. So nothing surprises me anymore. What we have to do is some exploratory work. We have to do some detective work. We have to base it on our experience and really study. I love taking younger engineers into a building with me and showing them the kind of investigative and the kind of direct detective work that we do. There's instrumentation that we can use. There's ground penetrating radar and X-ray and thermal cameras. We can do that. Sometimes we just have to cut a hole and look. We have no other way of doing it. So, it's really difficult now, certainly with the mandate to retrofit 1,500 concrete buildings in the city of LA. We have no idea what the rebar is inside that concrete. And I've been telling all my testing engineering friends, if they could come up with that miracle that we could see the rebar, they would be a very wealthy firm. So we keep looking for that, but at the end, we have to use every trick in the book. We have to do an accurate survey, and then we have to do the exploratory work if nothing else works.
Well, that's fantastic. I mean, it is a detective story for sure. That reminds me of something that Madison Spock said in the video itself. Madison, you had mentioned that the first thing you should do if you're buying or you have an older building is not to call your lawyer, but to call your structural engineer. Maybe you could comment a little bit from sort of a due diligence or a legal perspective, what it means to do the kinds of things that David just recommended, which is, bring out an engineer, have them inspect the building, maybe take some tests or some core samples of some of the existing materials to really understand, what you've got on your hands.
Am I coming through okay? There we go. I don't think anyone on this panel would disagree with that as my initial impression on that. But David makes an extremely good point, and that is it often takes a site inspection to tell what condition your property is in, and every owner needs to know what that condition is. In order to know what you need to do, you have to know what the condition of the property is and whether it presents any kind of a public safety threat people who will be on premises and the people who will be close by. So the first step in assessing, in protecting yourself as the owner of a property is to get that assessment so that you know whether you need to do anything, and if so, how extensive the work will be that you need to do.
Well, thanks, Madison. I'd like to bring in Linda Dishman and Jonathan Cohen. Linda, your role as CEO of the LA Conservancy is to promote, encourage, appreciate projects and owners that take the time to invest in historic retrofits or renovations of buildings. Can you talk to us a little bit about why you think more property owners and developers should take on an investment in renovating older properties, and kind of consider the benefits of restoring these older buildings, maintaining them, preserving them, and making them more resilient?
Well, there are benefits for doing this work, and so I really encourage everybody to investigate them. There are federal tax incentives for historic buildings that are on the National Register, which is a 20% tax credit. In the state of California, we have the legislation is approved for a 20% tax credit, but it's still kind of an unfunded option right now. But hopefully this year that will get through the legislature that would also add a 20% tax credit. So the combination of those two, I think, is really powerful in making the case to do the work now as opposed to waiting. And we also have in California, we have the Mills Act, which lowers property taxes for investment in historic property. So when you combine those three incentives, it actually is pretty powerful to make the numbers work. And we also have in California the State Historic Building Code, which codes were mentioned earlier. And having flexibility in terms of meeting codes is very important. And so that's another great option that exists for property owners to do the work.
David, just really quickly to follow up on what Linda said, are there specific codes or standards or guidelines that can be used to assess the safety of older buildings and to retrofit them so that they're safe?
Yes, there are federal standards that have been prepared over the last couple of decades. It's been very, very significantly improved. Now it's a very sophisticated set of standards out there called ASCE 41, Seismic Evaluation of Retrofit of Buildings. That sets the code, that sets the a procedure in place for structural engineers to follow. And it's a very methodic procedure. In addition to that, as Linda said, California is unique. We're very lucky, actually, that one of the few states in the country that has an historical building code in place. And that code, the structural provisions in that code are very performance based. They're not prescriptive. So there's a lot of interpretation up to the structural engineer, enabling us to get very creative in how we can tackle a problem. We do not have to follow all the requirements in the normal building code as long as we basically end up in the same place. And that gives us a lot of creativity that we can use.
Yeah, I think that's really important to recognize that good, experienced engineers are creative people, and that creativity will, often reduce the cost of a retrofit, focus on the most critical, important things like obviously protecting the safety of the folks in the building. Jonathan, what's been the feedback from your neighbors, from the downtown, the Chinatown district itself, on your renovation of the Society Hotel? Have you been getting good press or attention? Was it successful in your respect? From your perspective, I guess, absent the whole COVID shutdown we had last year?
Yeah, it's been a huge success, both for our customers and the city and for our neighborhood. From our opening in 2015 until the pandemic, our reasonably novel model of an affordable boutique hotel / hostel that's right in downtown has been very successful, and we've had some of the highest occupancy of any hotel in the state during that period. So it's really caught on, been very successful, and we've seen other types of properties come online, also in historic buildings in the downtown core area. So we've also had a bunch of mentions for the model in our building in the New York Times and LA Times. So really a great success all around.
And so I'm going to ask you sort of a financial question here. How do rents compare to other historic properties in the area for a building that has been renovated? Are there any premiums yet on sort of resilience? I mean, a hotel is obviously a place where people come and stay for a short period of time, but oftentimes, and I believe the Society Hotel is the same way. Is there's a sort of a retail on the bottom floor where somebody might rent the space for many years. Has that idea that more resilient buildings are a better investment found its way yet into again sort of premiums on rent or better lease negotiations?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that I personally don't quite have enough data points to answer holistically for the whole region, but I do know that in Portland, people really prefer historic buildings, both in the housing stock as well as commercial buildings. They appreciate the character and the style. And even if they don't necessarily command higher rents, they definitely fill up sooner. And as we're seeing right now, in the wake of the pandemic, there are more empty commercial buildings, and we're starting to see them get leased again. And the ones that are being leased first are the ones with that historic character. And I've seen at least one of the brokers in our neighborhood highlighting that these buildings have been seismically upgraded. So I do think it's on people's minds, and I think it definitely provides a premium as far as less lost rent for sure.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's great, especially in times like this when, as you say, there's a lot of vacant buildings. I remember being on a street in Los Angeles near the Chamber of Commerce, actually, and looking out over that street. This was last year in sort of the height of the pandemic, and so many vacant buildings. None of those were particularly historic, but I can imagine that when the area slowly starts to come back, that people will want to experience sort of the historic nature of a street or a neighborhood. And so, there'll be advantages to having those types of buildings renovated. Madison, I'll bring you back into the conversation. A lot of folks think of resilience as sort of a technical issue. It's sort of focused on, as David Koch was sort of saying, looking at the performance of the building relative to specific codes and standards. But, in our discussion that we had in preparation for the video, you saw it as much more. You see it as really a good business issue, a matter of economics. Why do you say that?
Well, ultimately, when liability is assessed, it's going to be assessed at some point down the road when a seismic event occurs. David, in his job, will protect the public safety. An architect, an engineer, a contractor does work that protects the public safety because it makes the building safe to the people using it and who are around it. When you plan to protect against liability, you're protecting against an event that occurs later. And AnheuserBusch is a terrific example of that, where a relatively small investment saved an enormous amount when a seismic event occurred. What Jonathan has been through, I think that would apply equally to his project as well. But eventually, the amount of money that you save if an event occurs, that if you've gone down the path of planning and properly protecting the public safety and establishing that you've done so with some diligence and with the means at your disposal, all turns out to protect you enormously when liability is assessed, if it is, after an event.
And we saw with the San Simeon earthquake, and you mentioned in the video the building in Paso Robles that collapsed, killing two workers, sadly. The court has been through this process now of understanding where the liability lies, and in this case, it was determined that the owner of a building, an older building, has a responsibility to understand that building and to be proactive and not rely necessarily on the state or a city or some other ordinance to sort of hide behind that liability. What do you think that means for property owners more broadly? Do you think that this Paso Robles case will be referenced, has the potential to be referenced in other cities, even outside, say, of California, if there's a large earthquake?
I think so, because there haven't been many reported cases. The law that governs retrofitting is mostly law that derives from statutes and ordinances, and it's a case that went all the way from start to finish, and there's a reported decision. But that's a very good example of how you end up in a place where liability is assessed by a jury after the fact, looking back at how you devoted your resources. And in that case, one of the key factors was that there was $250,000 that the owner had available, and the owner used it to install elevator access that increased traffic to the second floor. Had those resources, and resources are always limited, been devoted to shoring up the building, then the tragedy and the loss of 2 lives very probably would not have occurred.
That's a really good point. We got a question from the audience, actually, about multifamily housing, particularly apartment complexes. Many of you have heard of Softstory Buildings. These are buildings that, in order to maximize space, have apartments on the top and parking underneath. And so the structure on the first floor is kind of open to allow for cars to park in. Those are called soft-story buildings, and they were very common in the 60s and 70s. Now there are a lot of retrofits being required by cities to eliminate that deficiency. So what should the owner of a multifamily apartment complex be thinking about, Madison, when it comes to their potential liability for having a building that is a soft story condition? As I recall, I believe that there were some people injured or killed in the Northridge earthquake due to the collapse of a soft story apartment building.
Absolutely. And if you look, for example, Tom can probably elaborate on this. If you look at the cost in a soft story structure of doing the retrofitting that's needed to protect the building, The cost is, when I've reviewed those costs, extremely reasonable given the value of the building and the potential harm that can occur. And I think that's the important factor to keep in mind, is that when you have, if you have the engineering resources to protect the public, and if you have a reasonable amount of expenditure that must be made, then it becomes imperative upon the owner to take the steps that are necessary to retrofit that building, particularly if it's soft story, where you're going to have people in the building 24 hours a day. It's not like there's just an 8-hour time frame where businesses are open, but you have people in there all day, every day. Then it's incumbent upon the owner to very seriously and very diligently devote its resources to making sure the building is safe. And I know Optimum Seismic has done an awful lot of work in that area, and the costs that I've seen are incredibly reasonable.
Well, Tom, maybe I'll bring you in here if you want to talk a little bit about what those kinds of costs are. I know that Optimum's done a lot of Softstory retrofit work. Is it really challenging? Is it very hard? What are the kinds of costs that an owner might expect to say pay on a per unit basis to retrofit a building?
We would typically say that a soft story building could be retrofitted for $5,000 to $10,000 per unit. So on a 10-unit building, that perhaps $50,000, maybe a little more. But when you're looking at the possible costs of a death or a serious injury, which in the Paso Robles case was $1 million a head for the two people that died, and that was 10 plus years ago, the potential cost is horrific. Now, at the same time, you're also protecting against loss of rent, loss of your building, not having to clean up asbestos and other types of things that could come from a crumbled building. And those costs have to be considered too. When you offset that against the initial cost of doing the retrofit, it, as Madison says, becomes a pretty modest investment, and it's a very prudent investment. And the other thought I would say is that, and Linda touched on this in her comments earlier, the cost of producing a new unit in Los Angeles now is what, $600,000-$700,000 a unit. The cost of preserving and protecting and what is essentially an affordable housing unit in an apartment is $5,000 to $10,000 a unit. What's a better investment, protecting 20 or building one?
Well, I was just going to ask that same question, Tom, because we saw in the video the story of Anheuser-Busch, right? And it spent $11 million on a $1 billion investment. Rather than replacing the whole thing, it retrofitted it. And the benefit for it after the Northridge earthquake was something like $700 million when you consider the lost business, the potential damage that the building could have suffered if it hadn't been retrofitted. And so, that even though it's Anheuser-Busch and it's a huge facility, that scale often works even on something like an apartment complex, where the cost to rebuild it and replace it is significantly more expensive than the cost to retrofit. And that benefit cost ratio you get from retrofitting can be quite high. That was another question we actually had from an audience member was, what is the difference between rebuilding and retrofit? And that is, I think Tom has sort of captured that well there, is that, there are certain properties where you may determine that, it is better to rebuild it completely, tear it down and rebuild something new. But recognize that, taking an older building and restoring it, renovating it, bringing it up to modern sort of aesthetic standards, but also bringing it up to modern code standards when it comes to fire life safety and seismic, can be oftentimes a much better and worthwhile investment. So let's see, Tracy, I want to talk a little bit about, and I'm going to bring Jonathan in a little bit as a commentator. But Madison talked about liability. He talked about how incumbent it is on individuals who own buildings to make them more resilient or make them safer in earthquakes. We've seen in Los Angeles a lot of ordinances that have been passed that have been very successfully implemented to retrofit older buildings, whether they're concrete or masonry or these soft story structures. But there's still many, many jurisdictions around the country, around the world, that don't have these kinds of ordinances in place. from the business perspective, how does the business community feel about cities and jurisdictions being more proactive in establishing these kinds of ordinances to make older buildings safer?
Well, I'll tell you, Evan, we are strong advocates for cities to be proactive in this way. It doesn't require the onerous lift of passing an ordinance. It can be as simple, and they control this right now within their purview, is to expedite the time of review and permitting those property owners that want to address their building issues. And we find this in large cities, small cities, everywhere, is that just the time, and time equals cost, to get through the permitting process that's in their building and safety, streets and lights and so on. If they would just put some emphasis into their own staff and their own purview and say, this is a priority, anyone who comes and asks to address a project, let's get on it, let's expedite it, let's clear it as quick as we can, so those building owners can invest the private capital and do the right thing.
Yeah, and it's in the city's interest too, right? The more resilient a building is, the more likely it's to be around after an earthquake, generating property tax income for the city and the county, generating sales tax income for the city, generating employment for the city. So the city benefits whenever an owner wants to rehabilitate, retrofit an existing building, or even build a new building to higher performance standards. And so in that way, that relationship, that incentive that a city can offer building owners is important for both of you. Jonathan, back to the city of Portland. So last I checked, the city of Portland had about 1,600 unreinforced masonry buildings in the city. Now, we think of these as probably the most vulnerable types of structures, typically built before the 1930s. The Society Hotel was an unreinforced masonry building. I mentioned in the video that the Society Hotel, along with 3 other older, previously unreinforced masonry buildings that had been fully seismically retrofitted with all new structural systems, whether they be concrete walls or steel brace frames, sort of are no longer really, it's no longer proper to classify them as unreinforced masonry. The masonry on the outside of the building that you see is more of a veneer, really. It's the structure, the new structure inside is what is doing all the sort of heavy lifting when it comes to earthquake and gravity loads. But I know that the city of Portland has been really challenged in enacting the kind of unreinforced masonry retrofit ordinances that other cities, particularly in California, have done. Do you have can you talk to us a little bit about what some of the challenges have been in the city of Portland in enacting an ordinance, and what kind of requirements do they have? Is there even, say, a placarding requirement for older buildings?
Yeah, I haven't been involved in the entire process, but I know that it has been fraught with challenges. I think a common dynamic that I've seen being in the building trades and development world for the last 20 years, roughly, in Portland, is that the policymakers and developers can kind of be at odds because they perceive that they have different goals. And a lack of engagement between those parties can occur, and sometimes policy can be made without getting any input from those affected. For instance, the city commissioned a disparate group of college students to survey the buildings that needed significant retrofit, and then they marked those buildings with a red U symbol, which was literally like a scarlet letter, and they just kind of went up overnight without informing the building owners that it was happening. And there were reports that building owners really became limited then in potentially being able to get loans or even insurance on their buildings, because now there was awareness that there was additional risk with those buildings. And I think that just shows that there can be real missteps in building trust and building engagement that can come to a common outcome. And I hope I can talk about this a little bit more later, but I think that if there's more active engagement with all the parties and there's really a well thought out plan that there's more buy-in from, and a combination of incentives with enforcement, I think it can be a very successful strategy, and one that I hope to see, because I do think it's a necessary step, and I'd like to see a lot of those buildings see retrofit. Because oftentimes a lot of our blighted buildings are the same ones that need retrofit and need saving.
Well, that's terrific. I'd like to follow up then on that question of incentives. First, I just though would like to just kind of understand, are the issues of liability, say that Madison Spock talked about in the episode around quote general negligence and things like that, are they well understood, do you think, by building owners in Portland when it comes to earthquakes versus, say, slip and fall or old wiring, that kind of thing?
It's a good question. I think it's a mixed bag in Portland. We haven't had a significant earthquake, and I really don't know when the last date of a significant earthquake was. But there was an article that came out in the New Yorker several years ago that sent shockwaves figuratively through the community. And I would say pretty much everybody in Portland read that article and became very concerned. So I think there's very significant awareness of the risk of when an earthquake will occur in Portland, causing a lot of damage. So I do think that people are aware of the liability, but I really think a lot of the issue is that a lot of the buildings that are in most of need, are most unreinforced in Portland, are owned by small property owners, a lot of times minority property owners, and they've owned them for decades. And they don't have the funds or the use case to support the very dramatic retrofit needed to save these buildings. So we do have a lot of buildings that are in this in-between world that need a lot of incentive and need some more support. And I think the perception a lot is, oh, well, this is just an AnheuserBusch or some big corporation that owns this, and why don't they make the right choice and do what's right? Well, a lot of times it's not an option for people, and they don't know how to access the incentives. And honestly, a lot of times there's institutionalized racism in the processes at the development agency here in Portland, sometimes just in the form of unhelpfulness that dissuades these small property owners from taking those steps even when they try. So it's more complicated than it might seem.
Yeah, well, okay, so let's kind of have a little bit of a input from the rest of our group. Then we talked about some kinds of incentives. I think Tracy mentioned sort of expediting building permits and the city investing in having enough building officials and reviewers to expedite permitting on buildings that come in where there's a retrofit component. Linda talked a little bit about some of the federal tax breaks that are available for certain types of historic buildings, and some of the state tax incentives that are either being discussed or already sort of in place. What other types of incentives would be meaningful? And I think of banks, for example, or insurance companies. It behooves them to manage their own risks, right? A bank doesn't want to lend on a property that's really risky because if there is an earthquake and the building owner can't afford to repair the building, the bank is left with it. That the buildings that be sold as a distressed property, the bank will lose a lot of money. So it's in the bank's own interests to also promote the idea, not simply from a disincentive perspective, but from an incentive perspective. To incentivize more resilient buildings. To our panelists, Tracy, Linda, Jonathan, what are some of the kinds of incentives that you think banks could be offering for more resilient buildings, and what kind of strategies maybe a building owner should think about when going after a loan or talking to a lender?
I'll jump in. It's access and time. So be responsive. The banks to their customers when they're looking for capital and they put a business plan together and they can show the ROI, is to be responsive, right? So the first thing is to jump in and react and say yes. There is a lot of private capital wants to go to work right now. Especially, we've been in this COVID time where so many people have not been fully utilizing their own buildings as they put so many of their workers into remote work and have them at home. we've seen a desire for people to do some work on their buildings and to spend this time to be ready for when the economic recovery comes and there's a business line. But we still are facing problems again with the approval processes. So whether it's you're talking about banks right now, I talked about city planning before. So as in everything, I would say, light some fires under their energy to say yes and to get it processed. And let's get with private capital comes jobs. We mentioned, we're saving lives and we're securing our buildings and making them resilient. But in the near term, construction workers are going to work, so I would say yes, expedite the time, encourage people, and figure out a way to welcome, educate people, put the money out. There's a lot of money flowing right now in businesses because of the stimulus. And so people are using it to save jobs and the stimulus money. We need to be focused on that. But I want to draw attention that right now, our city governments did just get a lot of money in this last round of the American Recovery Stimulus Package so that they could keep local government open. We did see during the concern over this past year during COVID, some city department staffs were cut or restricted or put on hold. Now with the money coming in now, and they have to spend it in the next 18 months, we are in conversation with a lot of mayors to restore the city staffing along the permitting and building and safety. So the same thing goes at banks. I think, there's a lot of folks that are redoing their loans because interest rates are almost non-existent right now. So it's a good time to make your money go further. Well, I'd say that's my response to say yes.
Thanks, Tracy. Jonathan or Linda, anything?
I would just pick up on the expediting at City Hall, because that is a huge issue that Tracy identified. And when the adaptive reuse ordinance was passed, 20 years ago, the Mayor Reardon had a person in his office that just walked those permits through. And I view that, and I know many developers view that as like the main reason that the adaptive reuse ordinance worked, is that you knew that you were going to get access, as Tracy mentioned. I mean, that you would actually have an advocate in City Hall. And the Conservancy worked with a lot of developers during that time. And we brought bank money in. We brought in, I think $6 million total from several different banks. And it was helpful. I think it was more psychologically helpful than actually having the money go to be used. But in my mind, the single most effective thing was having that advocate at City Hall. And once his position was not there, it's much harder. It's much harder to do an adaptive reuse project in LA right now. And the buildings haven't changed. So it's the process. And so I think that that's something in particular that, Tracy, we would love to work with you guys on trying to, get this more streamlined, because I see that as a huge roadblock, and particularly on these smaller residential projects where the cost is not that, there really isn't that much extra money to wait around for this permit process. And so I think that is probably the single most important thing that can be done, and it's within the city's power to do it.
I agree.
Well, Jonathan, as a developer, I mean, how can your voice as a developer be successful, you think? Well, what is the kind of advocacy that developers can offer or provide to cities to promote this idea of incentivization for renovating older buildings?
Yeah, I think it can be really important to share the experience from a broad range of developers, large and small, because I believe that what happens a lot is that people imagine what it's like to develop a project, but haven't actually done it themselves. So they don't understand what the financing process is like. They don't understand, what the development process is like. And a lot of the solutions that were offered so far are very helpful pieces for that. I do feel that a financial incentive is still important at the city level. Sounds like there is one in LA. In Portland, we have an urban renewal agency that collects 25 cents on every dollar of tax income. And we have plenty of resources available to deploy in this way to support building owners to do these retrofits. And I believe that there should be low-cost loans, which they already have a program for other style retrofits. They'll have a loan program that could be expanded specifically for seismic upgrades. And I believe that it should offer incentives based on need and speed, meaning that those owners who are in greater need, smaller developers, minority developers, like I talked about, building owners who have a greater need, can get access to the funds first and have a degree of forgivability to a portion of the funds that they access. And those that take the money first to do those retrofits should also receive benefit in that way. And I think by amortizing those costs over a long period of time, that can be a very successful strategy. We have all the pieces in place. It can be implemented. And again, with feedback from developers of all scales, I think we can develop policy that works. I've seen personally, and we've appealed to our local and federal lawmakers during COVID, because this has really been like an earthquake for us being in the hospitality industry. This was a true disaster to our industry, one that I could have never imagined the scale and the duration going into planning our buildings. And we've seen the policies come out that were utterly tone deaf because they had no sense of what small business owners actually needed. For instance, our governor deployed $30 million to the state to assist restaurant and bar owners, such as ourselves. We have a restaurant inside our cafe, inside our building. And they deployed that across the state, allocating $7 million to our most populous county, which ended up being $1,500 per business. Well, my overhead is over $100,000 a month. So $1,500 is literally a waste of the state's money. They should have deployed it elsewhere. And that's sort of like, hey, here's what we're doing. It's completely tone deaf to the actual needs of businesses out there. So I think it highlights that incentives can be great as long as they are envisioned with the input of the people that will actually be using them, because then you're actually more likely to have a program that is successful because it's thought with the end user in mind.
Well, that what you just said there, I just remember what you said previously about when the unreinforced masonry buildings in Portland were identified and then painted with a big U or put a sign on them that had a big U, is that building that trust between the property owners and the city is important. It's important to get their buy-in, to get their feedback when it comes to things that are mandatory, but then also what would be most useful to them as incentives. One of the initiatives that the U.S. Resiliency Council is working on is an incentivization process with banks, with lenders, with cities, with others for investing in some way in resilience, either new design or retrofit design. When everybody benefits, we believe that everybody should be willing to share the cost. And that really also comes to matters of equity that Jonathan mentioned. We know that a lot of our vulnerable populations are thinking about day-to-day cash flow or day-to-day costs, and it's hard for them to think strategically down the road. They'd like to, but they just don't have the funding. And so when banks, for example, come in and invest in communities, they put a lot of money into vulnerable communities. This should be another way that they can think of to help those communities remain resilient for the long term. So in our last few minutes here with the panel, I'm going to circle back around to sort of next steps and what one should do. We had a question actually from the audience about is there any kind of benefit or recognition that an owner can get for making a long-term proactive plan to bring their building or their buildings into compliance with safety codes. I think particularly of work that I've done with, say, the University of California. University of California has many buildings, hundreds of buildings throughout its campuses, many that are very old and very seismically deficient. But the University of California can't simply shut down all its buildings until they're retrofitted or retrofit them all in a year's time. So they've come up with like a 30-year plan across the campuses to seismically retrofit their buildings, recognizing that there will be some risk the buildings will face while they're waiting to be retrofitted. Madison, Can you speak a little bit to the issues of is that a worthwhile thing? Is that something that can reduce an owner's liability? Is making a strategic, proactive plan for managing risks over the long time?
That's precisely the test under general negligence law. Is what steps have you taken? What resources did you have? Did you find out what you needed to know, and what's available to you to take corrective measures? No one can simply say 30 days from today we're going to have the building done and perfectly safe. It all is a matter of planning and progression, and it's all a test of reasonableness. The downside of that is it's a hindsight test. A jury will look backwards towards what you did and whether it was reasonable. But what you've described is a very reasonable plan that takes into account not only the resources that are available financially, right, but the resources that are available in the community to do effective construction and effective planning. So, yeah, Evan, I think it's very important, and it applies equally to property owners throughout any municipal area.
So, with that in mind, and with your admonition in our video to the first person you should talk to is your engineer, David Koch, can you tell us how an owner can reach out to their architects and structural engineers like you to take the first steps in understanding what they need to do to bring their buildings into compliance with modern safety standards, or even know if they need to?
Well, we probably ought to break that into two parts. One is the multi-building owner with a big inventory of buildings, and one is the single building owner. But the first thing that has to happen is come through and do a pretty quick preliminary evaluation of all those buildings. And then you can prioritize which buildings, as you were discussing with UC, that they basically prioritized all the buildings in their inventory. But tackling one building at a time, we have to go through, do all that exploration that we were talking about earlier, identify the deficiencies, and then at that point, I like to sit down with the entire team, the owner, the financial people, the architect, all the other design professionals, and see how the solutions to those deficiencies fit in with the plans of the building. So what are they planning to do with that building? What's the use going to be? What would they like to renovate? What do they care about? What are their priorities? And while they're doing those, we try to fit the structural mitigation, the seismic mitigation within all of those considerations, and then prioritize it. And whether we're going to do it all at once or whether we're going to do it over many years, talk about that time frame and really just plan out what that strategy is. So there's a lot of, as with any other problem, there's a lot of gathering of information at the beginning, then sitting down together and putting the plan together.
Well, that's great. And there are a lot of resources for folks in California and Oregon, Washington. Each of those states has a structural engineers association of California, Oregon, Washington, where they can find structural engineers. Obviously, contractors that you might deal with on a regular basis know and work with structural engineers. And so these are all good resources to find that structural engineer and understand your building. The journey of 1,000 miles starts with the first step, and the first step really is understanding and knowledge. Well, look, we've come to nearly the end of our time today, so I want to first thank very much our panelists, my deep appreciation from the U.S. Resiliency Council and on behalf of Optimum Seismic, Linda Dishman, the president of the LA Conservancy, Tracy Hernandez, the founding CEO of the Los Angeles County Business Federation, Jonathan Cohen, partner at the Society Hotel in Portland, Madison Spock, the partner at Spock, Capaldi, and Wagaman, and David Koch, a structural engineer and president of Structural Focus. Thank you so much for your perspective today, for your participation in this episode. Next month, we'll be looking at a really interesting topic, which is the confluence of green design and resilience when we talk about sustainability. It's this idea that green design is when we have a low impact on the environment. Resilient design is when the environment has a low impact on us, and we can't really have both true sustainability until we have both. The U.S. Green Buildings Council Los Angeles and the LA Chamber of Commerce are championing that episode. In May, our episode will be on science and technology, and we'll learn some of the science behind what both Linda and David have kind of talked about a little bit today, which is that making buildings more resilient, either retrofitting them or new design, doesn't have to be all that expensive, because there are a lot of great new technologies that are coming about in the construction industry that make resilience more affordable. So I hope you'll register for those episodes as well. At this time, I'd just like to ask Tom Robinson for a couple closing comments before we sign off.
Thank you very much, Evan. Want to say that we really appreciate the fine job you did today as both our host and our moderator. You kept the discussion moving very nicely, and that was very, very good. The panelists did a wonderful job today. The exchange that they had between themselves was very good, and the way they extrapolated on the various points that were made, I think will benefit many of our viewers. And I also want to say thank you to all of the viewers that tuned in today. We again had a substantial number of people from literally all around the world who tuned in, and we appreciate them being with us. There's another group that I want to mention before we sign off, and that's the growing list of organizations that are serving as our promotional partners. Each of these groups has been very generous in sending our program announcements to their members. And just quickly run through them. EERI, which is an earthquake organization, Culver City Chamber of Commerce, Pasadena Chamber of Commerce, Structural Engineers Association of Southern California, Century City Chamber of Commerce, Los Angeles Headquarters Association, Torrance Chamber, IREM, the Institute of Real Estate Management, Vernon Chamber of Commerce, Santa Monica Chamber of Commerce, Tembler, then the Huntington Park Chamber of Commerce, and a few more here, Beverly Hills Chamber, International Code Council, Southland Regional Association of Realtors, Public CEO, Urban Land Institute, and United Chambers of Commerce. These organizations have really helped get the word out to literally thousands of people each week on behalf of this Resilience Advantage webinar series, and we really appreciate their assistance.
Well, with that, we want to thank you again for joining us today, and have a great rest of the day.